McCuistion for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. Moss Adams LLP, certified public accountants and consultants, providing industry-smart tax, assurance, and consulting solutions to help businesses and their owners succeed since 1913. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
The Federal Reserve System was born in 1913 among controversy, and since then it's been blamed for the Great Depression and praised for helping lessen the financial crisis of 2008. The Fed, as it's often called, is America's central bank, and its purposes are to conduct monetary policy in pursuit of full employment and stable prices, to supervise and regulate banks, to maintain stability of the financial system, and to provide certain services to the government and financial institutions. Make no mistake, it is an arm of the government, though the 12 individual banks are nominally owned by banks that belong to the system. On this program, we'll look at how well the Fed performs its roles and how important the Fed may or may not be in today's world. To help us understand the situation, we have the authors of 2 new books on the subject. Joining us by phone is John Tamny, a Forbes contributor, editor of Real Clear Markets, a senior fellow in economics at Reason, and the author of Who Needs the Fed. John, welcome to the program.
Hey, Dennis, thanks for having me on.
Good to be back to you in just a few minutes. And here in the studio is Danielle DiMartino Booth. She was on Wall Street with Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenrette. She's a financial journalist who spent 10 years with the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. She's now president of Money Strong LLC, the author of this new book, Fed Up, An Insider's Take on Why the Federal Reserve is Bad for America. And just recently, Danielle, you've gone with the Commerce Street Capital as a senior economic advisor there with them. And of course, you're on CNBC and a lot of other TV stations all the time. So welcome to the program.
Great to be here today.
I think based on the title of your book, I know the answer to this question, but here's the question. Is the Fed good for America?
Certainly not in its current form, it's not. It's bad for America.
Now, why do you say that?
Well, I think that once power becomes a corrupting influence on an institution, that it has the ability to become very destructive. And if there's anything that we've witnessed over the past 10 and even all the way back to 30 years when Greenspan came on, it's that the more the Fed has been able to do, the less Congress has done, and the less right Congress has done by the people and for the people of this country. So the more responsibility that is handed over on a silver platter to these unelected officials, the more corrupt it's become.
All right, you and I talked before the program about a date which is in my memory because it happened to be October 19th, 1987. And I told you that I was sitting with some friends of mine, Steve Payovich, a retired economist now, and we asked a guy named Al Urbar this question. Do you think the Dow Jones is going to go to 3,000? It was at 2,200 at the time. And he said, yes, but not before it goes to 1,500 first. And that was the breakfast meeting on October 19th, 1987. Alan Greenspan was in Dallas to speak to the American Bankers Association that day. He flew back to D.C. Right. Tell us what happened after that.
We know he never made it to the podium that day in Dallas. I consider October the 20th, though, to be a pivotal date. We're coming up on the 30-year anniversary of the day that the Greenspan put was born. And that was the day that the Federal Reserve announced that it basically had the backs of the banking and financial systems. Alan Greenspan was obsessed with the stock market. And it's all come out in a recent memoir that's been written about him, but he was obsessed with the stock market. And I think that shaded his view of the world, and that was where things began to go wrong at the Fed, where mission creep really snuck in the current generation of central bankers that we have, to the benefit of investors, to the detriment of the rest of us.
So you write in your book, a lot of it is about the history of some of these things. So take us briefly through what happened in 97 and 98 and what the Fed did then with long-term capital markets.
Well, it wasn't just long-term capital management. If you consider what happened with the Orange County bankruptcy as well as the tequila crisis, both hitting in 1994. I mean, every time you had a crisis, a mini crisis erupt, if you will, the Fed would come riding to the rescue. Of course, you refer to 1998. Which is, I mean, moral hazard exploded after long-term capital management was effectively bailed out, run by 3 PhD economists, mind you, this big hedge fund. And the irony is, for your viewers who don't know the history, the one bank that refused to write the check that day, of course, was Bear Stearns and Jimmy Kane. And you see that sometimes revenge does take a little while to come back and bite you, but it does eventually bite you. But again, to your point, moral hazard. It has grown to be epic under the current generation, Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, epic in proportions, and investors simply don't believe, they do not believe that they're going to incur losses.
All right, so take us then up through the aftermath of the dot-com breakup, and then on to what the Fed may or may not have done to lead us up to 2008.
Well, I think one of the greatest misperceptions out there is that the Fed came riding to the rescue of the 2008 great financial crisis when it was actually a creation of their own. Had Greenspan not been as measured as he was in making sure that the financial system was never disrupted, we would have never had the housing bubble blow up on his watch. And it was something that I, among many of us, I was certainly not alone, but there were many people at the time, including his closest advisor, Ed Gramlich, inside the Fed, who was saying, we've got a real problem here. You mentioned irrational exuberance 4 years before the dot-com bubble blew up, but you didn't impose margin requirements. I'm telling you, we've got a situation in housing. We need to clearly make sure that the lenders that we regulate know that they've gone too far astray. This is going to cause a problem, and yet nothing was done again.
All right. Now, you have a very strong opinion that the Fed is powerful, in fact, maybe too powerful.
Too powerful.
Yeah, John, you, in your book, as I recall, you're not, I mean, you don't like the Fed necessarily, but you don't think the Fed has as much power as Danielle does. So give us a sense of what you think about the Fed, and then where you see their having gone wrong and what kind of power they have from your perspective.
Well, yeah, let's be clear. I think the Fed is an offense to common sense. We're talking about a group of economists who think that growth causes inflation, which is just laughably obtuse. We're talking about a group of economists whom, if you ask them, they would say World War II ended the Great Depression. We are talking about a group of economists who think that prosperity can be achieved through their fine tuning, which is just ridiculous. But I would probably disagree with much of what Danielle said, in the sense that the Greenspan put is largely a mythical concept. We hear about how he cut after '87 and stocks came back. There are other examples of this, but as you both just alluded to, in 2000, when internet stocks and the stock market took a dive, the Fed was aggressively cutting rates, but it didn't save the stock market. The put only worked when the underlying economy was already good. The housing bubble, Greenspan caused that, but if you've read Sebastian Malaby's book, what you find and what economic history is very clear about is that in the 1970s, the same Federal Reserve was aggressively increasing its funds rate, yet there was a similar housing boom. Greenspan was well aware of this. The idea that the Fed